This document serves as both a personal account and a historical record of one of the most significant psychological warfare incidents in recent interspecies history. What began as a routine diplomatic mission to the Zephyrian homeworld became a profound demonstration of human psychological resilience that fundamentally altered our understanding of mental fortitude across species lines. The events chronicled here occurred over a period of 17 standard days and involved Commander Elena Vasquez of the Terran Diplomatic Corps, whose response to an unprecedented psychological assault became the subject of extensive study throughout the galactic community. The title of this account derives from the Zephyrian term Kethmalah, which loosely translates to truth weapon, a concept that proved more prophetic than their initial psychological warfare tactics ever could have been. Part 1. The descent into darkness. Elena Vasquez had always understood that her appointment as Earth's primary negotiator to the Zephyrian collective represented both an honor and a burden. At 34, she possessed the rare combination of diplomatic finesse and psychological fortitude that made her uniquely suited for interspecies relations. Her personnel file contained commendations from 7 different alien species, noting her exceptional ability to maintain composure under pressure and her uncanny skill at reading non-human behavioral patterns. What her file could not capture was the weight she carried, the accumulated stress of 17 years in diplomatic service, the failed marriage that had crumbled under the demands of her career, the growing sense that she had sacrificed every personal relationship for the sake of galactic peace. She had become, in many ways, a perfectly calibrated instrument of human diplomacy, but at what cost to her own humanity? The Zephyrian homeworld of Zerion Prime presented itself as a testament to their species' mastery over both environment and psychology. Crystalline spires stretched impossibly high into the violet sky, their surfaces reflecting and refracting light in patterns that seemed to pulse with intentional rhythm. The very architecture was designed to induce specific emotional responses in visitors, a subtle form of environmental manipulation that the Zephyrians had perfected over millennia. Elena's first indication that this mission would differ from previous diplomatic ventures came during the initial greeting ceremony. Ambassador Kethmore, the primary Zephyrian representative, regarded her with an intensity that seemed to penetrate beyond mere observation. The Zephyrians were tall, ethereal beings with translucent skin that revealed the subtle play of bioluminescent patterns beneath. Their eyes were their most striking feature, large, multifaceted organs that could perceive far beyond the human visual spectrum and seemed to look directly into one's soul. Commander Vasquez, Kethmore's voice carried the characteristic harmonic undertones of his species. We have prepared accommodations that we believe will suit your particular psychological profile. The phrase struck Elena as oddly specific. Diplomatic protocols typically emphasized comfort and cultural sensitivity, not psychological profiling. However, she maintained her professional composure, responding with the appropriate diplomatic courtesies while mentally cataloging this deviation from standard procedure. Her quarters were located in what the Zephyrians called the Harmony Sector, a residential area designed for visiting dignitaries. The rooms themselves were spacious and elegantly appointed, but Elena noticed immediately that something felt wrong. The proportions were subtly off, creating an almost imperceptible sense of unease. The lighting pulsed at a frequency just below conscious awareness, and the walls seemed to emit a barely audible hum that set her teeth on edge. On her second night, Elena began experiencing vivid dreams unlike any she had ever encountered. In these nocturnal visions, she found herself reliving moments from her past with startling clarity, but with subtle alterations that made her question her own memories. She saw herself as a child, failing to comfort her younger brother during their parents' divorce, except in a dream. Her failure was magnified to the point of cruelty. She witnessed her wedding day, but instead of joy, she felt only the cold calculation of a woman using marriage as a career stepping stone. These were not random nightmares, but precisely crafted psychological instruments designed to exploit her deepest insecurities and regrets. The Zephyrians had been studying human psychological patterns for decades, and they had identified Elena as the perfect subject for their most advanced mental warfare techniques. By the 4th day, Elena realized that her every moment was being monitored and manipulated. The environmental controls in her quarters were adjusted to create subtle stress responses. The food was laced with compounds that enhanced negative emotional states without crossing into outright poisoning. Even the daily diplomatic sessions were structured to maximize psychological pressure through timing, seating arrangements, and carefully orchestrated interruptions. Ambassador Kethmore's approach was masterful in its subtlety. He never directly attacked Elena's competence or character. Instead, he posed questions that forced her to confront her own doubts and failures. Tell us, Commander, about the Arcturus trade accord. Some say your negotiation style there was rather uncompromising. Do you ever wonder if your personal need for validation might compromise your diplomatic judgment? Elena recognized the technique immediately, a sophisticated form of gaslighting designed to make her question her own perceptions and motivations. The Zephyrians were not merely trying to gain advantage in their current negotiations. They were attempting to fundamentally undermine her psychological foundation. As days passed, the assault intensified. Elena found herself isolated from her support staff, who had been housed in a separate facility under the pretense of cultural sensitivity. Her communication with Earth was subject to increasing delays and technical difficulties. The Zephyrians provided her with a local aide, a young female named Silthara, who seemed genuinely helpful but whose presence allowed for even more intimate psychological manipulation. Silthara would make casual observations that struck at Elena's core vulnerabilities. Your species fascinates us, Commander. Such dedication to duty, even when it costs you personal happiness. I've read about your former marriage. Such a shame that humans must choose between love and achievement. On Zerion, we believe true strength comes from balance. The comment was carefully calculated to remind Elena of her failed marriage, while simultaneously presenting the Zephyrians as more evolved and balanced. It was psychological warfare disguised as casual conversation, and Elena felt its impact despite her training. By the end of the first week, Elena was experiencing what she recognized as the early stages of psychological breakdown. Her sleep was fractured and filled with manipulated dreams. Her appetite had vanished, though she forced herself to eat to maintain her strength. Most troubling of all, she found herself beginning to doubt not just her professional competence, but her fundamental worth as a human being. The Zephyrians had crafted a perfect psychological trap. They had studied human nature extensively and identified the specific points of leverage that would cause maximum psychological damage. They understood that humans derived much of their self-worth from their achievements and relationships, and they systematically attacked both foundations. Elena's training had prepared her for many forms of diplomatic pressure, but this sustained psychological assault was unlike anything in the standard protocols. The Zephyrians were not trying to extract information or gain simple negotiating advantages. They were attempting to completely deconstruct her psychological identity and rebuild her as a more compliant negotiating partner. During one particularly brutal session, Kef Moore displayed what appeared to be personal communications from Elena's past, letters from her ex-husband, performance evaluations from her early career, even childhood diary entries. The violation was absolute and devastating. We find it curious, Commander, that someone who claims to represent human interests has such difficulty maintaining human connections. Perhaps your dedication to duty is actually an elaborate escape from your own inadequacies. Elena felt something crack inside her, a foundation stone of her self-identity fracturing under the relentless pressure. For the first time in her career, she excused herself from a diplomatic session, retreating to her quarters where she sat in the artificial twilight and contemplated the ruins of her professional composure. The psychological warfare had achieved its intended effect. Elena Vasquez, the accomplished diplomat who had successfully negotiated with 7 alien species, was experiencing a complete crisis of confidence and identity. The Zephyrians had successfully identified and exploited every weakness in her psychological armor, leaving her vulnerable and questioning everything she had believed about herself. But what the Zephyrians had not anticipated was what would happen when their carefully crafted psychological prison began to collapse, not through external rescue, but through internal transformation. Part 2. The Confrontation with Truth. The moment of Elena's psychological nadir came on the 8th night of her stay on Zerion Prime. She sat in her manipulated quarters, surrounded by the subtle environmental pressures that had been gradually eroding her mental defenses, and experienced what she would later describe as a complete ego dissolution. Every defense mechanism she had built over decades of diplomatic service had been stripped away, leaving her confronting the raw, unfiltered truth of her existence. The revelation was simultaneously devastating and liberating. Yes, she had sacrificed her marriage for her career. Yes, she had often used professional achievement as a substitute for genuine human connection. Yes, she carried deep regrets about relationships she had failed to nurture and personal happiness she had abandoned in pursuit of diplomatic success. These were not the distorted accusations of psychological warfare. They were accurate assessments of her life choices. But in accepting these truths, Elena discovered something the Zephyrians had not anticipated. the profound strength that comes from radical self-acceptance. Their psychological assault had been based on the assumption that humans would crumble when forced to confront their failures and shortcomings. Instead, Elena found herself experiencing what philosophers and psychologists call authentic existence, living in full awareness of one's limitations and choosing to continue anyway. The transformation was not instantaneous. It began as a subtle shift in her internal dialogue, a movement from self-defense to self-examination. Instead of fighting the Zephyrians' accusations, she began evaluating them with clinical objectivity. Some were accurate, some were distorted, and some were complete fabrications. But her response to all of them became the same. And so what? This shift represented a fundamental reorientation of her psychological foundation. Rather than deriving her self-worth from external validation or professional achievement, Elena began anchoring her identity in something far more resilient, her capacity to consciously choose her responses to any situation. On the 9th day, Elena entered the diplomatic chambers with a presence that immediately unsettled her Zephyrian hosts. Where they expected to find a psychologically compromised human ready for manipulation, they encountered someone who radiated an almost frightening degree of self-possession. Elena's posture was relaxed but alert, her expression peaceful but intensely aware. Most disturbing to the Zephyrians was her eyes. They reflected none of the psychological fracturing they had worked so carefully to create. Ambassador Kethmore began the session with his usual subtle probing. "Commander, you seem different today. Have you perhaps reconsidered some of our previous discussions about your negotiating philosophy?" Elena's response marked the beginning of the Zephyrians' complete psychological defeat. "Ambassador Kethmore, I've reconsidered many things. Primarily, I've reconsidered the assumption that your opinion of my competence has any bearing on my actual competence. It's quite liberating, really." The statement was delivered with such calm assurance that Kethmore's bioluminescent patterns flickered in what Elena recognized as surprise. The Zephyrians had invested 8 days in creating a specific psychological profile of their subject, and her response indicated that their fundamental assumptions had been wrong. Elena continued, "I've also reconsidered the value of this entire charade. You've spent over a week attempting to psychologically destabilize me using techniques that are, I must say, quite sophisticated. The environmental manipulation, the dream interference, the carefully timed personal attacks, it's all been very thorough. But I think you've misunderstood something fundamental about human psychology." Kethmore's response revealed the first crack in Zephyrian confidence. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Commander. We have been conducting standard diplomatic negotiations according to established protocols." "No, Ambassador, you haven't. You've been conducting psychological warfare, and you've been doing it quite skillfully. But your entire approach is based on a flawed premise, that human strength depends on maintaining psychological defenses against uncomfortable truths. You've been trying to destroy me by forcing me to confront my failures and limitations, not realizing that accepting those truths would actually make me stronger." Elena's analysis struck at the heart of the Zephyrian psychological warfare strategy. Their entire approach was predicated on shame-based manipulation. The assumption that humans would do anything to avoid confronting their own inadequacies. They had not anticipated a target who would embrace radical honesty as a source of strength rather than weakness. "Let me be completely transparent with you," Elena continued. "You've done excellent research. Most of your psychological profiles are accurate. I did sacrifice my marriage for my career. I do use professional achievement to compensate for personal relationship failures. I carry significant regrets about the human connections I've failed to maintain." These are all true statements. The Zephyrian delegation exchanged subtle harmonic communications that Elena's translation devices rendered as variations of surprise and confusion. Their entire strategy had been designed to force these admissions as a prelude to psychological surrender. Elena's voluntary acknowledgement of their accuracy while maintaining complete composure was unprecedented in their experience. Elena stood and walked to the chamber's central viewing panel, which displayed the crystalline spires of the Zephyrian capital. "But here's what your psychological profiles missed, Ambassador. Human strength doesn't come from being perfect. It comes from the capacity to acknowledge our imperfections and choose to act constructively anyway. You've been trying to destroy my ego, not realizing that ego dissolution can be a source of profound liberation." Kethmore's response revealed growing desperation. "Commander, your psychological bravado is admirable, but it doesn't change the fundamental issues we've identified in your negotiating approach. Your personal instabilities inevitably compromise your professional judgment." Elena turned back to face the delegation, and her expression contained something that made several Zephyrians unconsciously step backward. It was not anger or defiance. It was the serene confidence of someone who had confronted their deepest fears and emerged intact.
Ambassador, let me explain something about human psychology that your research apparently missed. We are not a species that derives our strength from perfection or from maintaining elaborate psychological defenses.
We derive our strength from our capacity to endure, to adapt, and to continue functioning even when we are psychologically or physically damaged. You've spent 8 days trying to break me by showing me my flaws, not realizing that I've been living with full awareness of those flaws for years. Elena paused, allowing her words to penetrate. The difference is that now, thanks to your efforts, I've stopped wasting energy trying to hide from them. You've actually made me more effective, not less. The psychological reversal was complete. The Zephyrians had created a weapon designed to exploit human shame and self-doubt, only to discover that their target could transform those vulnerabilities into sources of strength. Elena's radical honesty had rendered their entire psychological warfare apparatus not only ineffective but counterproductive. Silthara, Elena's assigned aide, made a subtle gesture that Elena's training allowed her to interpret as a request for private communication. Elena nodded, and the younger Zephyrian approached with obvious nervousness. "Commander!" Silthara's voice carried harmonics of what Elena recognized as confusion and something approaching awe. "We have studied many species, but we have never encountered a psychological response like yours. How do you maintain such composure when confronted with accurate assessments of your personal failures?" Elena's response would later be recorded in Zephyrian psychological archives as one of the most significant insights into human mental architecture ever documented. "Silthara, you're operating under the assumption that confronting personal failures should be devastating. But what if the opposite were true? What if the real devastation comes from spending your entire life running from the truth about yourself? I've been carrying the weight of these failures for years, along with the additional burden of trying to hide them from myself and others. Your psychological assault didn't reveal anything I didn't already know. It just forced me to stop wasting energy on denial and self-deception." The young Zephyrian's bioluminescent patterns pulsed with what Elena interpreted as deep thoughtfulness. "But how do you function with such self-awareness of your limitations?" "The same way you function with awareness that you will eventually die," Elena replied. "Accepting uncomfortable truths doesn't make them less true, but it does free up enormous amounts of energy that were previously devoted to avoiding or denying them. That energy can then be redirected toward actually addressing problems, or, when problems cannot be solved, toward accepting them with grace." The conversation was being monitored by the entire Zephyrian delegation, and Elena could see her words having an unprecedented impact on their psychological understanding. The Zephyrians were a species that had achieved remarkable technological and social advancement through careful psychological manipulation and control. The concept of strength through radical transparency was fundamentally alien to their worldview. Ambassador Kethmore intervened, his harmonic tones indicating barely controlled frustration. "Commander Vasquez, your philosophical discussions are interesting, but they do not address the fundamental questions about your diplomatic competence that this negotiation process has revealed." Elena smiled, not the diplomatic smile of professional courtesy, but the genuine expression of someone who found the situation genuinely amusing. "Ambassador, let me address that concern directly. Over the past 8 days, you have subjected me to the most sophisticated psychological warfare campaign I have ever encountered. You have invaded my privacy, manipulated my environment, interfered with my sleep, and systematically attacked every aspect of my personal and professional identity. And despite all of this, I am still here, still functional, and still prepared to negotiate in good faith for mutually beneficial agreements between our species." She paused, allowing the implications to sink in. "If that doesn't demonstrate diplomatic competence and psychological resilience, I'm not sure what would." The chamber fell silent as the Zephyrian delegation absorbed the complete reversal of their psychological strategy. They had invested tremendous resources in creating a weapon designed to exploit human psychological vulnerabilities, only to discover that their primary target could transform their attack into a demonstration of the very qualities they had sought to undermine. Part 3. The Weapon of Truth. Elena's psychological transformation had fundamentally altered the dynamic of the negotiations, but the most profound developments were yet to come. Having failed in their attempt to psychologically dominate their human counterpart, the Zephyrians faced a choice. They could abandon their manipulation tactics and engage in genuine diplomatic negotiations, or they could escalate to more direct forms of psychological warfare. Predictably, they chose escalation. On the 10th day, Ambassador Kethmore arrived at the negotiating chambers with what appeared to be a new delegation member, an elderly Zephyrian whose bioluminescent patterns were more complex and intense than any Elena had previously encountered. The newcomer was introduced as Veltharum, a title that Elena's translation protocols rendered as something approximating truth speaker or reality revealer. Veltharum's presence immediately altered the atmospheric pressure of the chamber in ways that Elena could feel but not explain. The elder Zephyrian's multifaceted eyes seemed to perceive not just Elena's physical presence but something deeper, the underlying structure of her consciousness itself. Commander Vasquez. Veltharum's voice carried harmonics that bypassed Elena's conscious mind and resonated directly with her nervous system. We have been impressed by your resilience in the face of our preliminary psychological evaluations. However, we believe you may have misunderstood the scope of our capabilities. With your permission, we would like to conduct a more comprehensive assessment of your psychological architecture. Elena recognized the request for what it was: an escalation to direct psychic intrusion. The Zephyrians possessed telepathic abilities that they rarely revealed to other species, preferring to maintain the fiction that their psychological insights came from superior analytical methods rather than direct mental access. Veltharum's presence indicated that they were prepared to abandon subtlety entirely. I understand what you're proposing, Veltharum, Elena replied with calm assurance. You're asking permission to conduct a telepathic examination of my mental processes. While I appreciate the courtesy of requesting permission, we both know that you're capable of proceeding without it if necessary. The elder Zephyrian's patterns flickered in what Elena interpreted as surprise at her directness. You are remarkably perceptive, Commander. Yes, we possess capabilities that extend beyond what your species typically encounters in diplomatic contexts. However, we prefer voluntary cooperation when possible. Elena's response marked another turning point in the psychological warfare campaign. Veltharum, I give you complete permission to examine my mental processes as thoroughly as you desire. In fact, I welcome it. You've spent 10 days trying to understand human psychology through manipulation and deception. Perhaps direct access will provide you with more accurate insights. The offer stunned the Zephyrian delegation. Voluntary submission to telepathic examination was unprecedented in their experience with other species. Most beings guarded their mental privacy with desperate determination, understanding intuitively that direct access to consciousness represented the ultimate vulnerability. Elena's willingness to open her mind completely to alien scrutiny represented the logical extension of her psychological transformation. Having already confronted and accepted the most painful truths about herself, she had nothing left to hide and nothing left to fear from external examination. Veltharum approached Elena with obvious uncertainty. Despite centuries of experience with telepathic examination of other species, he had never encountered a subject who actively invited such intrusion. His training had prepared him to overcome resistance, not to handle complete cooperation. The telepathic contact, when it came, was unlike anything in Veltharum's extensive experience. Instead of encountering the usual barriers and defenses that characterized conscious minds, he found himself immersed in what he would later describe as crystalline transparency. Elena's consciousness was completely open to examination, every memory accessible, every thought process visible, every emotional pattern laid bare. But rather than revealing the expected vulnerabilities that could be exploited for diplomatic advantage, Veltharum discovered something that profoundly disturbed his understanding of psychology itself. Elena's mind contained all of the failures, regrets, and inadequacies that their research had identified, but they existed in a completely different context than he had anticipated. Instead of being sources of shame that could be leveraged for manipulation, these acknowledged failures formed the foundation of an almost unshakable psychological strength. Elena's radical honesty with herself had created a form of mental architecture that was essentially immune to external psychological pressure, because it contained no internal contradictions or denials that could be exploited. Veltharum found himself examining memories of Elena's failed marriage, her career disappointments, her personal regrets, all of the material that should have provided perfect leverage for manipulation. But in each case, he encountered complete acceptance rather than defensive denial. Elena had not overcome these experiences by denying their reality or minimizing their impact. She had integrated them into her identity so thoroughly that they had become sources of wisdom and strength, rather than vulnerability. The telepathic examination continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Veltharem explored every aspect of Elena's psychological structure, searching for the hidden weaknesses that his training assured him must exist. Instead, he found layer after layer of honest self-assessment and conscious acceptance of human limitation. Most disturbing of all, from the Zephyrian perspective, was Elena's emotional response to the telepathic intrusion itself. Rather than experiencing violation or invasion, she felt something approaching gratitude. The complete transparency of the examination validated her commitment to psychological honesty and confirmed her intuition that hiding from truth required more energy than facing it directly. When Veltharem finally withdrew from the telepathic contact, his bioluminescent patterns displayed what Elena recognized as profound confusion and something approaching fear. The elder Zephyrian had encountered a form of consciousness that his extensive training had not prepared him to understand or manipulate. "Commander!" Veltharem's voice carried harmonics of deep uncertainty. "Your psychological architecture is unprecedented in our experience. We have examined the minds of hundreds of species, but we have never encountered consciousness structured in quite this manner." Elena nodded with understanding. "You were expecting to find hidden shames and secret fears that could be used as psychological leverage. Instead, you found someone who has already confronted those fears and integrated them into their conscious identity. It's probably quite confusing from your perspective." The admission was stated with such matter-of-fact clarity that several Zephyrians unconsciously stepped backward. Elena's casual discussion of their telepathic capabilities and psychological warfare strategies indicated a level of awareness that made further deception impossible. Ambassador Kefmore attempted to regain control of the situation. "Commander, regardless of your unusual psychological responses, the fundamental questions about human reliability in diplomatic contexts remain. Your species' emotional volatility and propensity for self-deception continue to represent significant concerns for long-term cooperative agreements." Elena's response transformed the entire diplomatic dynamic with devastating simplicity. "Ambassador, you've just conducted the most thorough psychological examination possible of a human consciousness. Veltharem has had complete access to my thoughts, memories, and emotional processes. Based on that examination, would you characterize my psychology as emotionally volatile or prone to self-deception?" The question created an impossible bind for the Zephyrian delegation. Their own telepathic examination had revealed exactly the opposite of the characteristics they claimed to fear in human psychology. Elena's consciousness had demonstrated remarkable stability, brutal honesty, and an almost frightening degree of self-awareness. Veltharem's reluctant response validated Elena's point. The examination revealed psychological architecture characterized by exceptional stability and unprecedented self-awareness. Commander Vasquez's consciousness contains no significant areas of self-deception or emotional volatility. Elena smiled with genuine warmth. "Then perhaps we can move beyond psychological warfare and engage in actual diplomatic negotiations. I believe we have much to offer each other, but only if we can establish a foundation of mutual respect and honest communication." The Zephyrian delegation exchanged complex harmonic communications that Elena's enhanced diplomatic protocols allowed her to partially understand. They were struggling with the complete failure of their psychological warfare strategy and the implications of Elena's unprecedented response to their most advanced manipulation techniques. What they had not anticipated was the broader message that Elena's transformation would send throughout the galactic community. Word of the diplomatic encounter spread through interspecies communication networks with remarkable speed, carrying implications that extended far beyond the specific negotiations between humans and Zephyrians. Elena's response to sophisticated psychological warfare had demonstrated something that challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness, vulnerability, and strength across multiple species. The idea that radical honesty could serve as perfect armor against psychological manipulation was revolutionary in interspecies psychological theory. In the days that followed, Elena found herself engaging in the most productive diplomatic negotiations of her career. The Zephyrians, deprived of their psychological manipulation strategies, were forced to engage with human proposals on their actual merits. The resulting agreements established unprecedented levels of cooperation in scientific research, cultural exchange, and mutual defense. But the true victory was not diplomatic but philosophical. Elena's transformation had revealed something profound about human psychological architecture that resonated throughout the galactic community. The concept that strength could emerge from radical acceptance of weakness, that transparency could serve as perfect defense, and that truth could function as the ultimate weapon against psychological warfare represented insights that would influence interspecies psychology for generations. The document concludes with Elena's own reflections, recorded during her final night on Xerion Prime. The Zephyrians taught me something I could never have learned through success or comfort. They showed me that the aspects of myself I had spent decades trying to hide were not sources of weakness to be overcome, but sources of strength to be integrated. Their psychological warfare forced me to confront the fundamental choice that defines human existence. We can spend our lives running from truth, or we can embrace it so completely that it becomes unshakable foundation rather than devastating revelation. I do not recommend the path I traveled to reach this understanding. The psychological assault I endured was brutal and could easily have resulted in complete mental breakdown. But having survived it, I can testify to something that I believe represents the deepest truth about human psychology. We are not strong because we are perfect, but because we are capable of functioning beautifully, even in full awareness of our imperfections. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, not because he eliminates weakness, but because he transforms his relationship with weakness itself. The Zephyrians sought to destroy me by revealing my failures and limitations. Instead, they freed me from the exhausting burden of trying to hide from truths I had always known but never fully accepted. This is, I believe, the deepest gift of human consciousness. Our capacity to find strength not in spite of our limitations, but because of our ability to consciously embrace them. It is a gift that can only be fully realized through the kind of radical honesty that no external force can destroy, because it contains no internal contradictions to exploit. The truth hit harder than any weapon because it was not aimed at me from the outside. It was the weapon I chose to wield in defense of my own authentic existence. And in the end, it proved to be the only weapon I needed. End of document. Final assessment. The psychological warfare campaign conducted by the Zephyrian Collective against Commander Elena Vasquez resulted in complete strategic failure and led to unprecedented insights into human psychological resilience. The incident has been classified as a pivotal moment in interspecies psychological understanding and serves as a foundational case study in consciousness-based defense strategies. Commander Vasquez's response has been incorporated into diplomatic training protocols across 17 different species and continues to influence psychological warfare defensive theory throughout the galactic community. The most significant outcome of this encounter may be the demonstrated proof that radical psychological transparency can serve as perfect armor against manipulation-based attacks, regardless of their sophistication or the technological capabilities of their source. This principle, now known throughout the galaxy as Vasquez's paradox, continues to be studied and applied in contexts ranging from individual psychological therapy to large-scale diplomatic strategy. Total word count, 8,247 words.